Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am delighted to be here today. My name is Amanda Herbert. I'm Associate Director for Fellowships at the Folger Institute of the Folger Shakespeare Library, and I'm also one of the co-directors for our Mellon initiative before Farm to Table, Early Modern Foodways and Cultures. We have been just so delighted to work with the Newbery on this project, and we are exceptionally happy to see all of you here virtually today. It's been just a delight to check in with friends and colleagues from all over the world, and this has been a really great equalizing experience. Thank you for being here. Especially thank you for being here for this session, which promises to be super exciting. This is our New Directions in Food Studies, a graduate student lightning round, where not only do you get to meet some of the newest members of our field, but also learn about their really cutting edge and exciting research. This session's a little bit longer than our last one. It's an hour and a half to allow for enough time for all of our panelists to be able to chat about their research and to introduce themselves to our food-loving public here. It's also going to be more conversational in the sense that we've quite deliberately tried to refer to each other by first names. We're going to be going in alphabetical order by first name. And I'd encourage, during our Q&A session, if our panelists want to leave certainly have your video back on. And if you even want to just keep yourself off mute so that it has more of a conversational feel, by all means, feel free to do so. I'll also share with the audience what I shared with our speakers ahead of time, which is that little technical glitches, of course, are going to happen over the course of the session. This is the world that we're in. And this is no different than if we were in person and someone got up to get a drink of water or dig a pencil out of their bag. These things are just part of being human. So there's no need for apologies and certainly no need for worries about any of that. We're all among friends. Okay, so we're going to go in alphabetical order and give our panelists a chance to just each introduce their work to you. Several of them have PowerPoint, so they'll be sharing their screens with you so that you can see their work. So let's start off with Ali.
Hi. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. It's nighttime here in Glasgow, so yay, Saturday night. Cool, I'll just share my screen and it's that one. So can you all see my slides?
Brilliant, looks great,
Brilliant.
Yes.
Cool, so I'm Ali, doing an Animal Studies PhD at the University of Strathclyde. I'd just like to begin my talk with a bit of historical background. So in England and much of the Western world, dairying has traditionally been the purview of women, and authorship has been the province of men. The production of cheese was, up until as late as the 20th century in certain areas of England, a well-regarded feminine skill that women passed on to their female family members and or female colleagues in the dairy. Men became more involved in dairying from the 18th century onwards as overseers and lower-ranked workers, particularly towards the end of the early modern period. There have been numerous reasons given for the shift, many of which are economic. For example, Ivy Pinchbeck argued that a new class known as dairymen appeared in the early 19th century due to the now richer wives of farmers no longer wishing to partake in what she described as the drudgery of dairying. But I'd like to look at another reason that I found from perusing a wide selection of housewifery and agricultural texts. The fact that, as highly educated male authors began collating dairying methods as part of an effort to understand the science behind its manufacture, they began to consider themselves the sources of dairying knowledge, despite lacking, this time, any practical experience with cheese production. And it's important to note that women began to be displaced from dairying in such books before this widely occurred in practice, which raises implications beyond the wider economic debates that I've sort of touched on. So, to start with the 16th century, there's no doubt that women are presented as authorities on dairying. In manuals like this, like Thomas Tusser's, there's a tentative nature to these discussions of housewifery, as it is assumed that the housewife will know how to make cheese without direction from those who know very little of women's work. And in this entry as well, we've got the first English book on dairying, that is, framed as a platonic dialogue between Dow, the Suffolk man, and a housewife, the South Hampshire woman, who asked Dow how cheesemaking is conducted in his region of birth. So at the time, dairying methods actually varied widely between regions, so it's not that odd that she asked a man for his advice, because the dairy woman, assuming she's not just some fictitious conjuring designed to allow a man to speak on dairying, is likely curious about other methods because she would not have been able to travel as freely as Tao for obvious reasons. And in fact, Tao is pretty conscious of the fact that it's unorthodox for him to speak on this subject, as he stresses that he is merely relating what he learned from my mother and her maids, and is not attempting to teach women their business, for it would be unseemly that a man that never made any should take upon him to teach women that have most knowledge and experience in that art. Turning to the 17th century, I believe that Dow's deference to dairy women's knowledge and experience is not reflected in agricultural manuals at this time. In fact, I can see a sense of frustration with dairy women in John Walledge's text, The Second Parts of Systema Agriculturae, as he comments that housewives will not be persuaded in the least to alter their vulgar method of making what he terms the worst cheese. Though he does not have any other insight therein than bare speculation and hearsay, end quote, he invokes the mechanic operations that all men are sensible of to argue for male interference in dairy over what he calls the covetousness and ignorance of women. This, what he calls philosophy of empirical science, was becoming increasingly popular thanks to the work of Francis Bacon, and was increasingly being applied for the pursuit of profit across a range of areas, including agriculture. Meanwhile, oral and experiential knowledge based on what Walledge has termed tradition and humour was being denigrated in favour of this new science. So, as previously mentioned, the 18th century is when gendered assumptions surrounding cheese production began to shift even more. There is the first hint in an agriculture manual by Richard Bradley that a man might be needed for some of the harder practical labour necessitated by growing dairies, while dairyman, the term, is used for the first time in Ellis's The Country Housewife's Family Companion, which is the one pictured there. In this text, Ellis is giving guidance on butter making by a male grazier who rears cattle for the market, while what he calls a great dairyman provides another recipe for butter. Now, this one is clearly a third-hand account because it's actually a dairyman's wife who skims every 12 hours in summer, so she's doing all the hard work. Thus, Ellis's book suggests that men are being addressed as sources of dairying knowledge in ways that they were not before. And unlike Dow's dialogue that I mentioned before, Ellis is more confident in applying the knowledge he has learned through watching women work, because he goes on later to instruct readers on how not to be a slow milker, and then he also complains about the idle sort of milkers, by which he means milkmaids, which I think is a bit rich, considering the fact that the task that he is describing is very hard to learn through observation alone. If you can imagine, I don't know if anyone's pulled any udders before, but yeah. So I think it can be said that there is no longer the deference to dairy women that is seen in earlier centuries from across these agricultural manuals. So I'd like to talk a little bit about Uzziah Tramley and his 1784 manual Dairying Exemplified, which has actually been wrongly listed by historians as the first ever text in England on dairying, though that should actually have been Dow's dialogue, which wasn't as popular. So while Dow was actually careful to frame his dialogue in such a way that he could give a voice to the dairywoman, Tramley instead begins with a complaint about the great number of inferior dairies. He is irate at the fact that dairywomen have continually asked him on his travels, what does he know of dairying, or how should a man know anything of cheese making? Fair. His reply at first seems reasonable, that he has consulted the best of dairywomen. However, he's still not undertaking any of the practical labour himself. I mean, Dow's words that it would be unseemly to do so, is a bit of a contrast to Tramley, who implies that dairywomen should just be thanking him for his advice. You can imagine him kind of storming in and going, this is how you should do things. I think this is quite similar to Walledge, who I mentioned earlier, because he was saying that he wished that good housewives understood more of this sort of philosophy, which is definitely a precursor to Tramley's desire that there be proper methods to the operation of dairying based upon rational principles, as he says. While Walledge argued that all men are sensible of the differences of the strengths and tastes of those things merely from their mechanic operations, end quote, they would be hard-pressed to understand any of this without years of dairying experience. Similarly, Tramley argues that dairymen have never called in the alliance of philosophy or knowledge, which suggests that women are just incapable of understanding scientific methods rather than being ill-equipped to do so due to, for example, lower rates of female literacy and the lessened opportunities for women to consult other women. Finally, Tramley was not the only agricultural author to denigrate women's labour and experience in the 18th century. William Marshall, William Ellis, Arthur Young, and others all contributed to this trend to displace women's authority over cheese production, positioning themselves as the holders of dairying knowledge and women merely the ignorant, as Woolwich said, practitioners. This is despite the fact that many of these authors came to be lambasted by various farm workers for their poor advice. The pejorative term book husbandry being coined this century to highlight how such authors were merely that, authors. Indeed, the weakening of women's grip upon the dairy industry, even before it became an industry, can be traced back to the emergence of new scientific philosophies, the privileging of rationality, as we saw earlier, and by the same token, the book, the written word, over years of intuition and experience that is actually needed to make the food. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali. Really powerful. For anyone who's just joining us, as a reminder, you can always ask questions using the Q&A button that appears in the center bottom of the screen. If you click on that, you'll be able to type your questions in, and then our team on the back end will be able to scoop them up and add them into the queue for me to ask to pass along to our panelists. Okay, next up we have Anil.
Hi, everybody.
Welcome.
Hi, thank you. I'm Anil. I'm doing a PhD in Heidelberg University on Indian-European food exchanges in the early modern period. And I think I'll just try to jump into it right away to not go over time. Just let me check where the data is.
Sure thing. No rush. You're fine. Perfect.
Okay, you can hopefully see the
Yes.
slide.
Perfectly clear.
Perfect. So in 1677, an English merchant named Isaac Laurence reached Surat on the West Indian shore, and I've mapped it here a bit. Soon after, he proceeded to Bengal, to the English factory in Hooghly, to the northeast of the map. Here, infection was rampant with the East India Company employees, which took the lives of most of the English merchants and their families. Deciding to escape this harmful environment, Laurence fled to Madras in the south, where Chennai is now marked, where in November 1677 he penned a letter to his brother William in England. Laurence had caught the disease himself, suffering from fever, vomiting, and diarrhea, indicating some gastrointestinal infection. Indeed, Lawrence's situation was so bad that he was afraid of dying, and that he told his brother that should you see me in my peruke awake, with meager, decayed countenance, you difficultly know me. And I'll just give you one example of the larger text, because I'm jumping a bit in the text, in different texts during my own speech. Laurence repeated this figure of speech in a second letter to his friend, a certain William Bowtell in London, explaining that the cause of his disease were the usual distempers here generated by bad diet and corrupt fire, without getting into details, however, about these diets. Lucky for us, an English physician named John Fryer traveled India around the same period, leaving England in 1672 and returning in 1682. In his travelogue, the doctor informs us about the diet of the local English population and its hazardous effect on health, which, in his words, may be attributed to their living at large, not the bearing themselves wine and strong drink, which immoderately used inflames the body. Food-wise, the English choice was very much focused on the consumption of meat, and a recognizable difference to the diet of other social cultural groups. For the Gentiles eat none, and the Moors and Portugals eat it well stewed, baked, or made into pottage, no nation eating it roasted so commonly as we do, as he says. Indeed, in Bombay, is more flesh killed for the English alone here in 1 month than in Surat for a year for all the Moors in that populous city. Fryer believed these eating habits to be quite unhealthy compared to those of the cohabitants, for, notwithstanding this mortality to the English, the country people and naturalized Portugals live to a good old age, supposed to be the reward of the temperance, indulging themselves neither in strong drinks nor devouring flesh as we do. What Laurence claimed, Fryer confirmed. Diet was a major cause of disease for the English in India, leading to similar symptoms in Lawrence's and Fryer's accounts. To cure the infection, Laurence applied 3 approaches. 1. He consulted with indigenous physicians, though his correspondence leaves it unclear when this began. Only in 1679, 1.5 years after writing to his brother and after moving on to Persia, he declared in another letter that all my Banyan doctors' remedies brought with me being insignificant and of small effect. He did not clarify what remedies were actually prescribed to him. From Fryer's travelogue, we know that indigenous physicians were regularly employed for treating East India Company staff, though Fryer also shared a skepticism towards South Asian medicine. Jumping back in time to 1677 and to the first letter mentioned. Writing to his brother, Isaac Laurence informs us that he recently got hold of William Wolwyn's Physick for Families, this book, a treatise published in 1669 by a lay medical practitioner. The said book largely contains a list of medical concoctions available for sale in London. The book does not provide recipes for mixing these concoctions, but offers instructions on their application. Laurence was aware that these concoctions did not adhere to contemporaneous medical teaching. He, however, hoped for their virtues as empirics, what we might understand as medicines believed to be helpful by testing alone without any systematic explanation for their power. Those, in Laurence's words, were strange cures. Thus, Isaac requested his brother William Laurence and his friend William Botel to send him such empirics from London, another approach to deal with his illness. Unfortunately, neither Isaac's nor William Laurence's correspondence inform us if Isaac ever received a delivery. The third approach was a change in diet, what he called in 1678, a moderation in our meals and drinks. He somewhat recovered during the same year, seemingly due to the reduction of alcohol and meat consumption, an alteration which had been beneficial to other English merchants as well, as he reported. Eventually, neither of the 3 attempts to cure himself succeeded, however. A year later, in 1679, Laurence traveled to Persia, got worse again, and passed away. While all 3 cures eventually proved no good, Laurence's approach tells us something about the epistemics and semiotics of food for this 17th century traveler. Though we might assume that the South Asian physicians had a certain knowledge about the treatment of local infections, Laurence did not grant them a lot of trust in helping him, according to his letter from April 1679. Certainly, he took their remedies, but he attributed no positive effect to them, though in a letter from February, 2 months earlier, he was still musing about his miraculous recovery. In between both letters, Laurence undertook the strenuous journey to Persia, so from Surat in the center to what you can see on the left, Persia, causing his fall back into sickness. Assuming that he started treatment with the Indian physicians earlier, he still drew no connection to his earlier recovery. Instead, he considered the moderation in food and drink the prime reason for his improvement. This he did in spite of the observation that the greatest debaucherous and hardest drinkers of wine and punch prove most strong and healthy, but a bad example to follow. Here we perceive a certain contradictory attitude, as Laurence observed beneficial effects on both moderation and excess, though finally he opted for moderation, not on an empirical but on a moral stance. Finally, there's a book. Without having any proof of the potency of the English medical concoctions and knowing that these do not hold up within the contemporaneous medical system, Laurence nevertheless invested trust into them, at least to such a degree that he asked to ship those concoctions around half of the planet. The prerequisite for this was that a semi-medical book traveled from England to India, where it became a symbol of hope for cure, despite the lack of any empirical or theoretical evidence for its working. Overall, theoretical, medical, or dietary considerations are largely absent in Laurence's deliberations. Rather, empirical observations on the benefits of dieting and an emotional informed hope, which was once non-empirical, informed Laurence's preferred treatment, the latter of which was imbued into a traveling book. And I'm going to stop here.
Perfect. Thank you, Neil. I was just about to tell you 1 minute to go, so your timing was
Okay.
just excellent. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, next up we have Daniela.
Hello.
Hi, welcome.
Thank you, Amanda. I too will jump right in, and
Gorgeous. Yep,
yep,
you can see that. Perfect.
make it prettier. There we go. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Amanda. Today I want to talk about two that for me are exceptional women of colonial Latin America. Their names are Úrsula de Jesus, an Afro-Peruvian religious servant in the convent of St. Clare of Assisi in Lima, and Mariana de San Jose, a white-veiled criolla nun in the convent of St. Rose of Lima in Puebla, modern-day Mexico. So first of all, for those of you who may not be familiar with the complex structures of female Catholic communities, I'm going to describe it very briefly. As you can see in this pyramid here, at the top of female convents were black veil nuns, who were often elite and aristocratic women who were able to pay generous amounts of money, the dowry, to enter convents. Below them were white veil nuns who did not have the means. However, they were of Spanish descent, and they were also white. At the very bottom were donadas, which literally means in Spanish donated, which meant that did not have the means to provide a dowry for the convent, and they were donated for the convent service. They were essentially servants, or more like slaves, often of African descent and indigenous descent. So as you can see in this pyramid, the internal structure of convents really mirrored the racial and social divisions of the secular world. Cooking was a responsibility that, depending on the convent, fell into the hands of white veil nuns or donadas, depending on the population of each one. So these two women I'm going to talk about today were cooks. Mariana de San Jose was a white veil nun, and Úrsula de Jesus, because of her African descent, was a donada. So first I want to begin by saying that religious women had the expectations of having a rich inner spiritual life, of praying in silence, of inner contemplation, of going to mass, etc. But for anyone who has ever been in a kitchen, it is hard to imagine how we can have inner contemplation and prayer when you're cooking. So this is the case of these two women. So today I want to talk about how these women grappled with their material responsibilities in the kitchen, with food, and the spiritual expectations of perfection and exemplarity that every religious woman had. So I proposed this idea that is culinary devotion, and that is the spiritual perfection that gets expressed through culinary imagination and the material culture of the kitchen, and performed through the embodied and somatic act of cooking. I have to say that the accounts of these two women survive in two diaries, manuscript diaries, that in the case of Úrsula de Jesus was dictated to other sisters. And these manuscripts are sort of like the raw material form that then gets transformed, rewritten by male priests, and sealed alight in the end as a print book. So here we are thinking metaphorically with the language of cooking, the products, the written products of these women are, so to speak, the raw ingredients of their own lives. So I'll jump right into Ursula. Ursula was born in 1604 in Lima. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman, and she worked for many years as a slave to one of the nuns in St. Clair. Many people would be surprised that nuns had slaves, but that is the fact. She was very famous for her devotion and her visions, and for that reason, one of the nuns offered to buy her freedom. And she was able to join the convent of Salonada after many years of being a slave. What stands out in her particular diary is an idea of imitating Christ in the kitchen. Unfortunately for us, she never talks about what food she was cooking, and rather we only have long descriptions of the suffering and the sacrifice that cooking entails. She describes the kitchen as a sort of oven, as a purgatory where the fire of the kitchen is similar to the purifying fire of purgatory. And in doing that, Ursula traces a parallel between her suffering body and the body of Christ. So it's really not a positive account of cooking, which might surprise many of us who are in love with all things food today. Here is a very short but telling quote. She is cooking and she looks at her hands. We have to remember, of course, that she is Black. She looks at her hands and says, "When I look at my hands, I often wonder what my Lord must have felt when they drove those nails through his hands." So for her, cooking is a very manual, embodied experience that is similar to that, to the suffering of Christ. So even if she does not have the time to pray or contemplate, cooking becomes a path to salvation and spiritual perfection, because it mirrors the body of Christ. Okay. Now, Mariana de San Jose, almost a century later in Mexico, as I said, she was a low-born Criolla woman, daughter of Spanish farmers. The convent of St. Rose of Lima in Puebla was the first convent dedicated to St. Rose of Lima, who, as you may know, was the first American saint officially canonized by the Pope. Her too, she recorded her spiritual experiences and visions in a diary, although we don't have the print account like in the case of Ursula, the transformed version of the male priest. And here, fortunately for us, we do have a lot of accounts of what she cooked. I'm going to show you here this is the beautiful, beautiful kitchen of St. Rose of Lima in Puebla. It survives, like, this is a picture I took, so it survives in perfect state. You can see here that there was a lot of care and money involved in the making of this kitchen. And we have to understand this kitchen in the context of a rising Criollo identity, of a rising Mexican identity, that saw the Americas as a repository of devout people who had the same dignity as European saints or European religious people. So what stands out in her diary is that she too is tired and exhausted all the time, like Ursula. But for her, cooking is not a source of suffering, but a source of love, because she has baby Jesus as her helper. So Jesus comes and she bakes cakes with her. She They both they make mole, they grind chilies, they make tortillas in very beautiful passages. And in that help, with all of these mentions of Mexican, very iconic Mexican dishes, the text produces an idea that God, in this case, baby Jesus, cooks and eats the Mexican foods that curious are identifying themselves with at the time, and that are now the symbols par excellence of Mexican food. So just to conclude, for these two women, cooking was a sort of hands-on, put in practice way of writing through their bodies. And cooking and writing for them were two sides of the same practice of devoting themselves to the service of their sisters and to God. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. That was an incredibly rich paper. Okay, next up we have Danielle.
Hello.
Hi, Danielle.
I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm just going to read from my notes.
Okay, go for it. I will mute myself.
This conversation about eating American animals in the 17th century stems from my dissertation project, which reads across printed narratives in Spanish, French, and English to point out the many intersections between eating animals and crafting colonial narratives. I purposely frame my research topic as eating animals instead of eating meat, because I combine an animal studies framework with a food studies one. This project seeks to demonstrate that the early modern traveling Europeans conflated the living animal with the dead food item. By recentering the animality of meat, we can create a history that both rejects anthropocentrism and contextualizes food history. Most of the literature that encircle European colonialism feature a tension between expectations of appropriate food and the realities of eating unfamiliar animals. Some animals are presented as curiosities, tried for fun. Some out of necessity during periods of desperate hunger. Others invoke cultural and moral aversions. The animals in these accounts often represented an anxiety of edibility, and the books became the forum where early modern Europeans exposed their uncertainties about consumption in the Atlantic world. Further, the printed and circulated books that featured stories of eating animals represent another layer of consumption, in which European readers consume the stories about the animals in an act of cultural digestion. This study considers not only the colonists' negotiations about animals as food, but how authors employed those negotiations to influence readers across the Atlantic. A central question that I wish to posit here lies in a contradiction in the writings about Jamestown, Virginia. Books about America present a picture of a promised land and a paradise filled with natural wonders and resources, but against a backdrop of pervasive hunger and dangerous starvation. Here's our contradiction. How could America be both a land filled with fish, fowl, deer, and other beasts, and also filled with the perils of hunger? Further, how does this contradiction translate to a European readership? George Percy's 1606 account on the Jamestown colony demonstrates the aforementioned contradiction. Percy describes his crew stopping on a series of islands to replenish their stomachs after a long voyage as they made their way up the coast to their final stop in Virginia. Percy reported that they did not need to use any of their food stores brought from England because of the natural fauna provided by the environment. He writes that, "Some went a-hunting, some a-fowling, and some a-fishing, where we got great store of conies, sundry kinds of fowls, and great plenty of fish." Continuing on, they stopped again in the Virgin Islands, where they caught great store of fresh fish and abundance of sea tortoises, which served all of our fleet for 3 days. Despite the systemic compilation of indigenous resources, including the sturgeon, deer, bear, foxes, otters, beavers, and other animals, much of Percy's crew still starved and died in Virginia. Despite the ample animal resources available in Virginia, the early settlers there experienced unsettling bouts of starvation that the leaders needed to account for. whether amplifying the situation to investors, potential settlers, or patrons to explain why things went so horribly wrong, or by minimizing the failures to encourage continued support. The dichotomy between hunger and food sources was reconstructed purposely to support, not hinder, continued colonization. Percy, and other English authors in particular, needed to explain, defend, or excuse their early failures as they attempted to keep up with other colonial powers. By emphasizing the desperation of their experience in America, writers communicated to their readers the incredible obstacles they managed to overcome. Readers, in turn, consumed both the delightful and the dreadful encounters with animal foods that they will never have to taste themselves. The hungry colonists seemed to care less about the caloric density of animal bodies while starving, and consistently made choices based on a cultural ordering of moral edibility. The 1624 A Brief Declaration by the Ancient Planters of Virginia is just one account that portrays a hierarchy of animal foods, ordered from most to least desirable. The colonists first ate all the pigs, the dogs, and the horses living in the colony. In all cases, Europeans sought land-dwelling quadrupeds and fish as their first choice for food, whether native or imported, because they were recognizable and familiar food sources. This was then followed by less desirable and palatable animals, like the rats, mice, and snakes. These animals are never the first choice because they do not match traditional European agriculture, but also because they elicit fears, anxieties, or disgust. The text continues to confess that they ate human flesh and excrement, as well as bodies of recently dead colonists and indigenous people. Thus, cannibalism appears in this account, as it does in others, as the inevitable end of an animal food hierarchy seen to its conclusion. The issue the accounts take is not with the biological edibility of the available animals, human and non-human, but the cultural, personal, and moral acceptance of certain animals as food. Another 1624 account by the Virginia General Assembly blames a lack of assistance from England. For had they at that time given us better allowance, so lamentable was our scarcity, that we were constrained to eat dogs, cats, rats, snakes, toadstools, horse hides, and whatnot. After the whatnot, once again comes cannibalism. One man, out of the misery he endured, killing his wife, powdered her up to eat her. The powdered wife story is employed in several narratives as the final atrocity of the starving time. But in this account, it is expressly presented to be the unavoidable result of leadership and resource failures. Whether any man in Jamestown did or did not consume his wife, readers in England consumed several stories about such an event, helping to create the mythology of the American colonies. These are just some of the examples for how we can approach animals as food in colonial narratives. The human-animal relationship is integral to a complete understanding of why Europeans made their choices about food sources. The cultural resonance and symbolism of the non-human animal mattered to colonizing Europeans, as it often does to meat-eating humans today. The next phase of this project explores the ways that translations and edited collections, once or twice removed from the first-hand accounts, omits or edits the descriptions of hunger and questionable animal food choices. The first-hand authors had their own reasons for highlighting the unpalatable cuisine of early colonization, as did the later writers for making their content more palatable for their readers. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Totally fascinating. I can't wait for us to discuss that. Okay, next up we have Eileen.
Hello.
Hi.
So the title of my paper is Elementary Grammars, a preliminary codicological study of Universitat de Valencia Biblioteca Histórica MS 216. So out of all of the medieval vernacular recipe collections originating in the Iberian Peninsula, the Catalan collection, or the Catalan text rather, known as the Llibre de Sant Silvi, is the recipe collection that has attracted the greatest general interest. surviving in a single manuscript, which is pictured on the previous slide. This is my actual manuscript. The Livre de Saint-Sauvy contains 72 culinary recipes and has been tentatively dated to the first quarter of the 14th century, although the manuscript itself, MS-216, is from the late 15th century. MS-216 is described as a, quote, messy and disordered miscellany, end quote, in the university catalog. This is borne out by the contents, which you can see on the slide before you, and you can read through those on your own. I'll spare you for the time being. The relationship between this assortment of texts is an aspect of the manuscript that has been severely neglected in scholarship on this manuscript. Despite the academic attention paid to the Livre de Saint-Sauvy over the years, no published research to date has attempted to engage with the correspondences between the culinary collection, the Livre de Saint-Sauvy, and the other texts that appear in the same manuscript. Far more effort has been expended on exploring the relationships between different extant medieval culinary recipe collections, since medieval recipes were not generally written from scratch for each collection, but often adapted from earlier written versions and then homogenized in order to conform to the style of a given collection. This type of comparative research has been very fruitful, illuminating hitherto hidden connections throughout the medieval world writ large. And it's on the basis of such research that, despite surviving only in a single copy and a single manuscript at that, the Livre de Saint-Sauvy is known to have enjoyed a wide circulation in the medieval period and even into the 16th century. And yet, very little is known about the compiler of the Livre de Saint-Sauvy, the process by which recipes were collected, or even the purpose of such a collection. Like many of the texts that have sown the field of pre-modern food studies, the Livre de Saint-Sauvy poses more questions than it answers. In this paper and the few minutes that follow, I consider this manuscript holistically as a miscellaneous manuscript, which is to say a collection of assorted texts, in order to illuminate some of the affinities among the texts that appear between the limb-vellum covers. MS-216 has suffered extensive damage over the years, including the loss of multiple folia and the rearrangement of several of its quires, especially at the beginning of the codex. The manuscript has been rebound at least twice. The current binding is the product of modern conservation efforts and does not reflect the original order of the folia. So, drawing on paleographical, decorative, and codicological evidence, it is nevertheless possible to demonstrate a medieval relationship between these texts as they appear in the current iteration of manuscript 216. By considering the composition of the manuscript as a whole, I hope to shine a new light on both the Livre de Saint-Sauvy and the environment that produced this manuscript. So I'm not going to have time to go through all of this evidence, but suffice to say it was very labor intensive, and I think I've proved my case really definitively. So the evidence that I've outlined on the slide before you allows me to demonstrate with really reasonable certainty that the codex in which the texts were bound was originally intended to include all of them. It's also reasonable to imagine that all of the texts were copied simultaneously, and that the current post-medieval binding nevertheless reflects medieval understandings of the affinities between the different texts that comprise this miscellany. Such an analysis of this manuscript allows not only for the reconstruction of the original codex in its correct original order, but also for a more contextualized understanding of these texts, clearing the proverbial ground for consideration of the relationships between the texts that appear in the current iteration of the codex. From the order of the text alone, some patterns already emerge that permit grouping. Disregarding the order of the texts for the time being, so this is not in the current order, the manuscript can be described not just as a miscellaneous collection, but as a manuscript containing multiple works dedicated to organizing and applying knowledge of the natural world. Works dedicated to the treatment of disease appear alongside works on the different properties of natural materials, including herbs and rocks. Both the anonymous lapidary and Macrofloridis Herbal de Virtutis Herbarum organize and impart usable knowledge of the material of the natural world. Arguably, the Livre de Saint-Sauvy does the same, although the emphasis is on process and product rather than the ingredients. The various medical works deal with the outcome in a somewhat different sense than the culinary recipe collection, and are more logically grouped with one another than with the Livre de Saint-Sauvy. Works on telling time, the location of celestial bodies, and conducting astronomical observations betray a heavily quantifiable bent, alongside prayers which might very well have been used in concert with this temporal information. Didactic works concerned more with morality and behavior may be profitably compared with the treatise on Latin grammar that appears towards the end, as texts which would not have been out of place in a medieval school text. Overall, these are works of science and moral philosophy with practical applications, several of which are known to have been used as educational texts. So this paper began with the Livre de Saint-Sauvy and its relationship not to other culinary recipe collections, but rather to the other texts alongside which is bound and with which it has survived to the present day. What then can be said about the ways in which this manuscript reflects the environment that produced it from just this codicological survey? And I've cut all of the codicological parts, so just bear with me. So certainly manuscript 216 attests to the existence of a broader medieval Mediterranean intellectual culture. And as a product of that culture, it is also emblematic of the multiple relationships between different aspects of medieval intellectual culture at the time of its production. As far as I'm concerned, the most provocative aspect of the Livre de Saint-Sauvy arises from the qualities of the text that resist easy incorporation into existing frameworks of academic scholarship, gastronomic or otherwise. The epistemologies that underpin much of the work on pre-modern and modern, much of the work on modern foodways do not necessarily apply to this text. Similarly, medieval culinary history currently occupies no particular place in connection with medieval intellectual history, except perhaps as a footnote tucked alongside the history of medicine. Since the Livre de Saint-Sauvy corresponds to some aspects of modern cookbooks, those are the aspects to which even scholars of medieval history have clung, disregarding the ways in which this text might complicate understandings of medieval culinary culture if we were to approach it from a slightly different perspective. By working with this text in isolation or only in the context of other culinary sources, medievalist academics conform to a methodological hegemony in ways that serve neither the text nor the academy. The Livre de Saint-Sauvy bears witness not only to the dawn of Catalan cuisine, to quote one of the articles I read on this text, but to an elementary grammar distinct from our own. Modern values were not those of the medieval period. Even early modern values were not those of the medieval period. The two are, in fact, quite often in conflict in ways that can seriously distort our scholarship. Lest food studies run the risk of catering to the gastronomic epistemologies of the Euro-American gourmand, rather than challenging, unsettling, or otherwise questioning them, historians of pre-modern food studies and food cultures must ask different questions. Medieval culinary recipe collections such as the Livre de Saint-Sauvy represent a system of culinary aesthetics that may reveal, in turn, medieval understandings of the body and society and intellectual culture itself, if we can only figure out what questions to ask of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. That was phenomenal evidence. Okay, next up we have Hannah. Hello.
Hello, welcome everyone. And I wanted to take this opportunity to thank our conference organizers for really, I think, turning lemons into lemonade here and making kind of a very clever setup in terms of how we can have this conference be sort of for everyone. Okay, everyone see this slideshow?
Yep, looks excellent. I love that image.
I am Hannah Smith-Drellick. I'm a PhD candidate in English, and my dissertation is on appetite and food and metaphor in early modern England. So I want to talk today about one recipe, and more specifically, a picture that depicts a step in the recipe, and to use this as a case study to think more broadly about the genre of the cookbook itself, or as Jennifer Conyard-Black and Melissa Goldthwaite say, books that cook. So as scholars of the recipe or receipt book, we tend to answer the question, what do early modern recipes make, with a diverse array of examples, from culinary dishes to cleaning supplies, from medicines to beauty treatments. So today I'd like to venture a new category to add to this omnivorous catalog. In order to answer the question, what recipes make, I'd say recipes also make spells. And so I know yesterday in the panel, Michael Twitty said, cooking is a spell. And so I'm kind of really taking this literally. So I'm going to make a connection from cooking to spells through a visual image in Hugh Napkin's book, but I'm going to first take a step back in order to frame this all. So I'm suggesting that we should consider, or if we consider recipe books as didactic, or at least a performance of didacticism, They're interested in teaching, they're interested in instruction, they literally tell you how to do something. I have two questions. So how can images be used to support narrated in words, recipe book instructions? And what is the role of something unknown, something enigmatic, purposely obscure, then in this instructional genre? So to briefly offer some answers to my first question, I have here some fun things I found in the archive. So this is an approved medicine for the falling sickness or convulsion fits. And you see here, I mean, this is a really kind of stretch of the term image, but you know, you see a crude triangle. It says the shape of the bag, but it must be a pretty deal bigger than this pattern. So it's literally saying, cut this pattern into a triangle. You wear it on your neck, you fill it with all sorts of things, 4 pennies worth of red coral in fine powder, 4 pennies worth of man's skull, I believe. And then the little end must be pointing downwards to the pit of the stomach. So here we have a kind of attempt to have an image that is a literal, theoretically helpful way to wear your little neck bag. Here is another image in another cookbook, also manuscript. This is what we call in Instagram term flat lay. It's a bird's eye view of food, and it's a diagram of food, of courses on the table. So where to put your artichokes, they must be to the left of the ducks and the geese. Here is a interesting drawing in Italian. It's a recipe, it's a secret of how to make a fallopia. So a phallus of glass. If you turn your head sideways, you can see it's a glass tube in which there's a candle on the bottom. I believe it is for attracting fish underwater. So again, kind of demonstrative, instructional method for making what's in these recipes. So I'd like to suggest that drawings in early modern cookbooks, when they appear, and they actually are quite rare when you consider today's Instagram, you know, food media, which is pretty much indistinguishable from image, you know, text and image. When these images appear in early modern cookbooks, they tend to be working towards a level of clarification, instruction, elucidation. So this now comes to my second point, because of course I have an example to the contrary. So to answer my second question, what is the role of the unknown in this image in a recipe book, I'd like to introduce Hugh Napkin. He's a surgeon working in London in the 1620s and 30s. This is a manuscript recipe books of medicine that is laid out for print, but there's no evidence that it was ever printed. And this is possibly due to the fact that Napkin got into some legal trouble in 1627 and again in 1629. He was accused twice of medical malpractice. So that may or may not be part of why this never appeared in print. So this caught my eye first because I'm working on charms and the idea of charm poetry. And so this is a charm from Mr. Stevenson for a fever, a Cortian or tertian ague, which probably was malaria. So here's what you do. You cut the apple crosswise into slices. Using a reasonable large sprig of rosemary, you carve these symbols below into the apple slices. So those circles are visual representation of food. You stick rosemary through the core of the apple, wrap it all up in paper with paper sheets between these cross-sectioned apple, like this layer cake. You let the feverish patient eat each layer of the apple, not the paper, 2 hours before each fit, which seems a difficult thing to predict, but perhaps this is why it's always been proven. And then you burn the rosemary. So I don't believe there are any more instances of graphic images in Hugh Napkin's book, but I'm sure as many of you are kind of wondering, are these images really meant to be unknown, or are they just unknown to me? Are they unknowable, or are they ciphers that can be deciphered? So I was hoping to kind of crowdsource this, but I also have done a fair amount of research and preparation, and I think I've come pretty close. But not totally. So here is a comparison of measurement shorthand. So Dr. Egloff talked about this in the previous discussion. And as you can see, these are measurements, 1 gram, 1 ounce, 1 pound, 2 ounces, this shorthand, and I would say I don't see really any overlap here. I then turned to this table of alphabets from Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. So from left to right, we have on the left signs of the zodiac, so Libra, Capricorn, signs of the planets, and then sort of earth, water, air. Then the second, we've got the Hebrew alphabet, which was a big favorite of Agrippa's and a lot of mystical occult philosophers. Then we've got Chaldean, then we've got Greek, and then we've got Latin. And so Cornelius Agrippa, it's kind of this big deal in terms of occult philosophy. And I'm just going to read a quote from Dr. Faustus by Christopher Marlowe, who says, he wants to be as cunning as Agrippa was, whose shadow made all Europe honor him. So I think we can say, at least, depending on what you view as evidence, that Agrippa was an influential person. And so finally, I think this is probably the closest I've come to identifying these symbols. And this is again in Agrippa's book. These are figures of divine letters. And so again, I'd love to hear what people think. My guess is that these symbols in Hugh Napkin's book on this apple are pseudo-Agrippan, in the sense that Napkin may be attempting to recreate these figures of divine letter from memory. You could call this informed gibberish, perhaps. Of course, this is entirely speculation on my part, but what I'm really interested in then saying is that the occurrences of images like the one in Napkin's book of medical receipts, while it's fairly rare, I think it is evidence of a larger generic crossover that I think is worth considering, the bridge between magic books of secrets and recipe books. And I think I'm very interested in finding out if there's much more of a connection between these two than previously considered. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Hannah. I had a feeling that you would love that that thing that Michael said yesterday about recipes being served, food being spills. I thought that would really resonate with you. Fascinating analysis. That was great. Okay, last but certainly not least, we have Merritt.
Yes, so last but not least, I would like to tell you about my research for my PhD project. I am studying food consumption practices in early modern Dutch cities. And as a bioarchaeologist, I have been fascinated by what I find as an archaeologist and also by what I don't find. And that's the cue to how I came to study cookbooks. And sideways, I am also interested in heat and material culture. So for this presentation, I will tell you a bit about this ongoing research. So fuel, material culture and cookbooks in the Netherlands between, let's say, 1500 and 1850. I've selected 3 cookbooks that you see here. The first is the oldest printed Dutch cookbook that we know of. The middle is a very detailed frontispiece of the Sensible Cook. And the third is sort of the start of a series of cookbooks that are made for frugal housemaids. And I like these frontispieces because they show us what a kitchen should look like. Ideally, with a lot of room for a lot of people to work in, because these cookbooks were, well, written for the elites. And fuel, to talk about this, when studying food preparation, of course, you need a fuel to heat your food. And for the Netherlands, it is turf. It is always turf for this time period, or peat. And when it's dried, it's called turf. When looking at, for instance, England or Belgium, there is this energy transition from wood and charcoal and peat to coal. But within the Netherlands, this did not happen. And historical books even write about the, well, the fact that turf or peat is most preferred, and all people use it unless you are, for instance, a baker or a brewer who needs so much fuel, then they choose, for instance, charcoal or coal, which you can see here being well, distributed from the ship on a cart to be sold at the market. And it's in Dutch, so for those few people who are in the audience that can read Dutch, it says that coal is preferred by the smith or the glass blower for crystal glass. You can also use it in rooms, though it is not as good as wood or good peat. And he mentions that a lot of people in London, they have problems with breathing, so you should just not use coal. And wood coal is also, charcoal is also often used in many countries where people don't have peat. And because the Netherlands as a low country, well, used peat up until the 20th century even, this was just of small relevance for the kitchen. And moving over to more material culture, we have a lot of Dutch paintings, of course, portraying lovely home, well, sceneries where you can see people cooking. And I chose these pictures because they also show the hearth. That's because another small difference with, for instance, England or Belgium and other countries is that it took a very long time for the Dutch to change from, well, cooking in the hearth, using an oven or a stove. And again, up until the 19th century, many Dutch people, especially in the periphery, they still use the hearth. And what would that be like, cooking over an open fire? I like this picture, this experiment done by Roos van Oosten, published in Medieval MasterChef, where they tried to cook over an open fire with either wood or another type of fuel to see what would happen to the material culture that we as archaeologists find. And I have an old cooking pot, which I got when I got my PhD position. And they are very rarely blackened. They have no traces of soot or smoke or whatever. So they were not cooked like you see on the top, which is blackened, and that will crack the pot. So by doing some experimental research, we've learned a lot actually. But to get to the cookbooks, because that's why we're here, I've been reading cookbooks to see it's in Dutch because, well, reading Dutch cookbooks, but once they're finished, there will be an English list as well. Looking at what people wrote down in those cookbooks to see which plants were used and which animals were consumed, but also how they were prepared, how long they were cooked for, and the material culture and the cooking preparation. So over a stove or in an oven or on a hearth. Those are all listed. I'm working up to the 18th and 19th century with increasing numbers of recipes to put into Excel. But preliminary, you can see that there are quite a lot of, well, kitchen utensils named in cookbooks, but only you can see the coal fire and the oven or stove that is mentioned. For the rest of the recipes that I've studied so far, there is no mention of, well, which type of fuel is used, or if an oven is used, or a coal fire, or whatever. Apparently that was all taken for granted. It was common knowledge. I do expect, but I'm still working on that, to see a shift going to the 19th century when these frugal housewife or maiden cookbooks are written because they are very descriptive. So I assume that they have more information, which would inform us more about the people using those cookbooks, from cooks, professional cooks, to more domestic use. And these are the lists, again in Dutch, of all the ways to prepare food. For instance, in the 1612 and 1667 cookbook that I've studied, many mentions of either cooking or frying or putting in on a spit and roasting. And I'm going to analyze these terminology to see if it can tell us anything about the material culture used. If, for instance, it points to a slow fire for simmering or stewing, to see if maybe the material culture is changing, but we cannot see that directly in the recipe books because the material culture is not mentioned. So I really like this picture of this alchemist because it shows someone who is actually reading a book whilst cooking and looking at a lot of paintings and well, drawings. There are very rarely depictions of someone actually working in the kitchen, reading whilst doing. So that makes me think that perhaps the way we now use a cookbook, laying next to me on the table whilst I'm cooking, is not necessarily the way people used to work. But of course, these are all just momentary depictions or idealist depictions. So it's something to keep in mind whilst studying these sources. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Merit. I always love hearing about your research. So fascinating. Okay, so stay put, Merit, and everyone else, please join us via video and sound if you've got it. That would be great. And then everyone can see the array of all of our faces and hear our voices. Okay, so I have a list of questions from the audience, which I will feed to you all. Thank you, audience members, for your incredible questions. I don't know that we'll have time to get through all of them, but we'll do our best. So our first question is for Danielle, and we have both a Daniela and a Danielle, so I will try very hard to be very specific in my pronunciation. This one is for Danielle, and the question is, did Europeans starve in part because they employed traditional European hunting methods, trying to apply these to the new terrain and game of the colonies?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I would say that in part, that's part of what's going on. There's a lot of other elements to consider as well. The evidence across all of the literatures that I look at shows that when Europeans worked with and learned from indigenous people in the area, they fared and ate better. And when they don't, then they don't. So part of it is not really knowing how to navigate their terrain. And we certainly see that in the Virginia example, where they did not usually have good relations with the native people. And in fact, most of the time when they did eat, it was because of indigenous help. And that's just really something I didn't have time to get to in the presentation, but it's really important to my project. But other things going on too are just not even knowing how to hunt to begin with. A lot of the initial settlers didn't have that skill set in England, and so they didn't even have anything to bring to America. That wasn't something that all members of the population were entitled to do. And then not understanding the migration patterns of the indigenous fauna as well. One of the things that comes up a lot in the accounts is when they first get there, they're so excited about all the sturgeon and all the available fish. But once a certain part of the season comes, they're all gone. They've moved to a different part of the water. So that initial reaction to the overwhelming resources, shifted in the winter months and the fall when not only the fish but all the other animals move around as well. And also my final point goes back to that indigenous relationship. They can't really explore the woods around them looking for animals to hunt when usually every time they go out, at least the accounts reflect that it's pretty dangerous for them because they don't have positive relationships with the indigenous people. So it's a yes, but there's also other elements going on there as well.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, our next question is from Rob Wakeman. Thank you for this fascinating panel. Yesterday, Irina Dumitrescu spoke of historical recipes as a kind of desire. True enough, but it seems like for many of us, recipes in food history also act as an archive of horror, fear, emotional, and physical pain. I wonder if the panelists might say a few words about why we study food that we would not eat due to dietary restrictions or cultural bias, and or why these foods fascinated earlier readers.
Well, let me say that when studying these old recipes, we do come across, of course, well, ways of preparation and especially parts of an animal or even a plant that we would never eat at this moment. But it's the whole idea that you use every part of an animal, mostly talking about animals, that might now fear or disgust us. But in the past were either delicacies or just, well, you wouldn't put it to waste. As also Marissa told us yesterday that she talked about a manuscript listing what you should plant, when you should harvest it, and how you should preserve it, because food should not go to waste. The thing is that maybe we've lost touch, or we cannot imagine it, but that thing that it's not something that we recognize, that is intriguing. So it's, well, it asks us to study it and think about what has changed that makes us look at it in a very different way compared to past people.
I would also like to mention, in certain cases, at least with these travelers to India, sometimes matters just quite practically what can you get as food, like especially when they take the ships and they go to islands like St. Helena or something like that, where they have to wait for a while. There's just this limited availability, and that's of course something which relates to what Daniela said earlier. I do also think that to a certain degree there can be elements which have a longer cultural connotation, like as you might know, in the 15th century there was a strong notion that like the paradise, the Garden Eden, somewhere is physically present still in Asia. And what Paul Friedman, for example, has very well shown is how this also linked to spices as ingredients. And in this situation, we might think about how taking something in and consuming something from Asia might be linked to ideas of that it has a paradisical origin, even though it might not taste well. And going further than that, there might be also a medical element of it, saying we consume something like what we also nowadays maybe say sometimes, like medicine can't taste nice, or it's not supposed to taste nice. So there are multiple sets of answers, I would say, to that.
Thanks, Neil. That's great. Yeah. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? Eileen?
Yeah, so I think one of the earlier panelists mentioned that he was vegan, and so in the reconstructions of historical recipes with his class, he often substitutes, and so there's the impossibility of recreating things that I think is really key here, but there are so many intervening different sets of ethics, I think, and so my interest in food studies coincides with like an increased awareness of sustainability issues in my access to food and supporting local agricultural movements and things like that. And so I've, as a result of my historical work, actually changed my own food habits. But that's not necessarily connected directly to the idea of, am I going to try and reconstruct something? in order to eat it, which I think, as all of us working on historical food, is a frequent question that you get at conferences. Whether it's because it's not sanitary, it's not possible, there are ethical concerns, or taste buds have changed, our expectations have changed. But recognizing the many different kinds of interconnectivities with gender, class, race, geography, and so forth, it's a different way of viewing historical subjects that I think is difficult to access using more traditional methods. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in it. And so that has more to do with my politics, really, than it does with my speculative interest in what people actually ate.
Thank you, Eileen. Danielle, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I'd like to add something to everyone's really well-made points already, that I think, especially with the work that I do on people having to make decisions between different types of animals that they're willing or unwilling to make, it speaks to something I think that persists culturally even now across cultures. What would you eat or not eat if you were traveling? What's too far if you were hungry? I think these are immensely human questions and moral, ethical questions that people are faced with even now. And it's kind of what led me to this project in general. I'm very much interested in how these travelers and settlers, even when hungry and starving, you see them still putting in some sort of moral limits to what they're willing to do. And so I think that there is a preoccupation for their own experience, but the readers of their time, there's a dark fascination of what you will or wouldn't eat when you're starving. And I think that extends to now too, as scholars, as readers of these texts, that we're kind of darkly fascinated by the lengths that someone would or wouldn't go when that desperate.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one? Okay, we'll move to the next. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying, for me, I actually, instead of just studying the food, the cheese, I'm actually interested in the animal behind the food, which is what my PhD project is on, is trying to give agency to the cows who are actually producing all this, as well as the women who would be their co-workers at the time, or at least were kind of presented more as their co-workers before the advent of industrialized agriculture. And I'm specifically looking at how agricultural manuals kind of, as well as fiction, in the latter part of my project, sort of tracked this decline in closeness. And then obviously you can't take the food and the cheese out of this. So for me, I'd say as a vegan, it does get a bit odd sometimes, but I think it's really important to actually study it as well, because in animal studies, it is all about centering the animal and also seeing, I think, the food as something that comes from them and can't be divorced from them. And so, yeah.
That's great, Ellie. Thank you. Anybody else on this one? Okay, we will move to our next one. So our next question's for Daniela. This one's from Delia Moldovan, who asks, Daniela, what a fascinating talk and topic. Agreed. I was wondering how you related the accounts of the cook nuns to the type of religious practices by the Franciscans and the Poor Clares, which encourages an almost physical relationship with religion through meditation. Your talk made me think about much earlier texts, such as the Meditationes Vitae Christi.
Thank you. That's a really good question, because, well, obviously, if you read the guidelines and instructions of what is expected from the women in St. Clair or any other convent, you're reading at the ideal scenario, right? They are not supposed to eat meat, or very little, only when they're sick. In the case of the Franciscan order, of course, they have the 3 vows of very important vows of poverty and humility. And in the case of Ursula, there's a wonderful passage where she complains about other nuns ordering her around, like, can you make me this, and can you cook this for me? And there's this higher ranked nun who asked her to grill meat, which in a sense would contradict the ideal expectations of a Franciscan nun. And what Ursula does is that she refuses to grill the meat. And so the nun asks other women to cook for her. And Ursula gets really angry and puts out the fire and just pours water over the burning coals. In a sense, that passage condenses that her being the lowest ranked, part of the lowest ranked group is actually following the Franciscan values more closely than the higher ranked nuns who are essentially living a life of luxury, because meat in this context is still very much a luxury for anyone, really.
Yeah, and such an astounding moment for her to exert some agency, right, and have some authority in that moment. I know better than you do
Yeah,
about how we're supposed
we're
to
not
behave.
eating today, sorry.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Okay, thank you. Really thought-provoking. All right, next question is for Eileen from Helmut Klug. In German manuscript traditions, we have so-called house books that connect knowledge useful for a household that are in the miscellanies, like your manuscript. Is there any information on the origin or provenance of that fascinating manuscript?
So as for my manuscript, it was produced in Valencia, and so the paleographic evidence and some of the contents of the astronomical treatises make it very easy to locate it to Valencia specifically. It's quite a luxuriously produced manuscript, so the owner or commissioner was wealthy and probably didn't have particularly good Latin, because there are several unique translations into Catalan. But that said, they were certainly highly educated for the 15th century when the manuscript was copied. Beyond that, it's impossible to say, because the earliest provenance note that we have is from a confiscation from a monastery in the 18th century. So beyond that, it's really difficult to say. I'm interested in these house books. German is the next language on my list to collect as a graduate student, so to speak. But I'm familiar with the 14th century Book of Good Food and so on, which are culinary collections that I don't believe were copied in miscellanies. So I wonder if the house books are medieval or a more early modern phenomenon, as was my understanding. So I hope that's enough of an answer.
Thank you, Eileen. Okay, next for Hannah from Jenny Egloff. Do the pennies in the triangular neck bag refer to the price or the weight of the items contained in the recipe? Oh, so like, is it a penny's worth of whatever, or?
Thank you, Jennifer, for that. And I'm sure you probably have your own opinions on what that is. Let me get this up. Oops. Can I get it back up so we can all look at it? I realize it's a bit unfair.
No, this is great.
Just flip through things without you taking a look. So my understanding is a penny. Can everyone see it? A penny. Mm-hmm. My understanding, I've only seen it as a kind of transactional, like, price measurement. I briefly took the opportunity in this time to look up on the OED to see, because I never actually considered before it being a weight measurement. And I'm not, it's only used as as a commercial transactional phrase in the OED. And I also am suspicious about whether or not pennies and the weight of, copper, gold, or money is standardized enough. I mean, nothing, as you know, as her entire presentation is that nothing was standardized, but I'd be curious to see if anyone else. I also just generally think that these ingredients, red coral, man skull, which my guess would be mummy, like powdered mummy, which is probably not actually man skull, but it's interesting in terms of what other panelists have talked about in cannibalism and medicinal recipes. Peony seeds, fine powder, mix them together. So my guess would be money and not wait, but I'd be very curious if other people have, you know, thoughts on that. I'll stop sharing this.
Thanks, Hannah. That's a really good question. And I'm sure you and Jenny can chat about it offline too if you want to. I've seen in some recipes, like asking for the amount of dried nutmeg, for example, that will fit on top of a coin of a certain denomination. So it'll say like as much as will fit on a shilling. And we've done some adaptations at the Folger. And so because I'm like a huge nerd, I like looked up how big an early modern shilling was. And then I like compared it to American money, and I found that it's about the size of a quarter. And it turned out it was like a teaspoon. So just to add that into the mix, that's also something that people do with money in the kitchen in terms of measuring and thinking about measurement too. So, okay, next we have a question for everyone from Fran Dolan. These are all fascinating presentations. Again, totally agreed, thank you. I wonder if the panelists would be willing to discuss how they found or defined their projects and found the key pieces of evidence that they've shared with us today.
I can take up on that.
Thanks, Daniela. Yeah, please go right ahead.
Well, in my case, my wider project focuses on, it tries to highlight the human agents behind early modern Spanish and Latin American food. Not thinking about master cooks or what we would call today chefs, but more the anonymous human pieces that make a kitchen function in the past and the present. So Ursula is a text that has been published and edited. It has been recently caught more attention from scholars. In the case of Mariana, it's a miracle, really. It's a manuscript that right now it's in a shoebox. It's housed by the nuns. It's not in a public archive. So they were generous enough to share it with me and to allow me to digitize it. It's a very long manuscript. It's like 1,000 folios of years and years and years of her life. And really the most powerful and colorful passages of the diary are those that happen in the kitchen. Of course, not everything is about the kitchen, but it's those places where literary and religious conventions are not really followed. And when you find mole and meatballs and these little images that don't really fit into the genre that this diary belongs to, that for me is the most fascinating and valuable aspects of this manuscript. So it was mainly by chance. I encountered the manuscript just mentioned in a dissertation of in the National University of Mexico, and I contacted the nuns and went down there, and they cooked me a meal very fittingly, and allowed me to take a look at it. And just a shout out to these beautiful women who allowed me to do that.
It's an incredible research moment. Anyone else want to share on this topic? We are a little short on, we're actually, shame on me, we're like 2 minutes over, but this is the last session for the day. So I don't mind going over a little bit if other people want to share on this topic as well.
I mean, in my case, it was that I knew that the British Library holds a large part of the old holdings concerning travelers to India, like the English travelers to India. So I basically just read, I spent basically good part of a year in London reading through thousands of pages of different letters and these kind of things, and diaries and travelogues of people going to India. And I think that's how I ended up with Laurence, with Isaac Laurence, because the fascinating part about him is compared to, and that might maybe relate to a bit to the other question which was asked by Angela Silverman in the chat as well. Like the letters Isaac Laurence wrote are extant in a letter book in the British Library, but they have never been published. So compared to travelers like Tavernier, for example, or also John Fryer, whom I mentioned earlier as well, these have been revised and published later. So these are usually quite easily accessible because like Fryer, for example, that has been multiple times published in big publication cycles. But I think finding something like Laurence is a bit of luck in a sense. You sit there and you just have to read through manuscripts to a good amount, because I don't believe that the finding aids even told a lot about the content of these texts, and even more so if you go, for example, to India, to the archives. In the archives in India, there are some holdings on the Portuguese and the English and the Dutch, but there's no finding aid whatsoever. So
yeah, it requires a lot of creativity. Thank you, Anil. Yeah, Danielle and Merritt, you both had your hands up too to comment in on this. Did you want to say anything?
Sure. Yeah, it speaks a little bit to some of the things that we've already talked about, but as a lifelong vegetarian, for me, looking at these accounts when I first started to get involved in it, it all looked crazy to me, right? Like eating cows and pigs and iguanas and penguins, it was all one thing. And so that kind of sparked this question of, well, what did they think about it? Was the penguin for the early modern traveler the same as a chicken, or is it as kind of jarring as it was to some of my meat eating friends, right? So those are the kinds of questions that sparked this project. But you know, just like any new wave of scholarship, once I started to look at the narratives and the written material, animals were everywhere. They just weren't being talked about as much as I thought we should. So in terms of source material from that initial question, it was much easier than I expected it to be to find a lot of accounts about animals. They're all over the narratives, because at the heart of it, the colonizers needed to eat something. And so they were talking about this much more than even I expected. So that part was relatively easy, finding all the stuff. It was just all the things that came after that provide the challenges for scholarship. But
Thank you, Danielle. Merritt, did you want to weigh in?
Oh, very shortly, because I have the sort of luxury that we have, Anil knows as well, a very nice gastronomic library in the Amsterdam, which is part of the University of Amsterdam, and they have collected many cookbooks published in the Netherlands or the Low Countries, and also foreign cookbooks, as well as manuscripts. And the only decision I had to make was, will I study manuscripts or printed cookbooks? Sometimes I think I made the wrong choice and I should have studied manuscripts instead, thinking that they might better reflect what people actually cooked at home, which I learned last year when looking in the folder through the manuscripts with recipes crossed out and things written in the margins, that I didn't find the cookbooks in the university library in Amsterdam. So for me, it was just selecting a few cookbooks that might be representative of a general trend, and also asking a lot of people for help, knowing which cookbooks have been translated or not. And so I think everything was there for me in Amsterdam. I only had to travel there and back a few times, and now a lot of it's digitized, so I can work from home, which is ideal. So I had a little bit less problems finding my sources. I had to just choose which one to study and which not, maybe for the future.
There is always more work to be done. Absolutely. Thank you, Merritt. Okay, I think we have gone way past our time, 7 whole minutes past our time, so I don't want to press my luck anymore, but thank you all so much for sharing incredible, incredible new directions in research. My brain is just buzzing with all of these new ideas, and I'm thrilled to see where it turns out for all of you. Okay, and thank you as well to the rest of the audience whose questions were excellent and who I didn't get a chance to read aloud. So please contact our panelists, ask them those questions on your own. And anything else from our Newberry organizers? Voices in the crowd. Do you want to weigh in before I bring this to a close?
Thanks, everybody. This was so great. Really appreciate all your hard work and energy. And thanks to our audience for your wonderful questions and your attention on a Saturday.
Agreed. Thank you so much. This is really a terrific panel, guys.
Come
Really.
back on Monday, everybody.
Yes. Please come back on Monday. Yeah. And everyone else have a really good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.